I grew up admiring Richard Dawkins. When I first became a content creator over 2 decades ago, it was my dream to one day have the honor of interviewing him. The reason Dawkins was my hero was because he was unapologetically and unwaveringly devoted to scientific knowledge and reasoned thought. He taught me that politeness and so-called respect should not stop us from questioning other people's false claims, and that the truly respectful thing to do is to use skepticism even in situations where social conventions deem it awkward to do so. Unfortunately, in his old age, Dawkins seems to have turned his back on both science and reason. In one of his books, The God Delusion, Dawkins recounts a short anecdote about a professor of his who held an incorrect view regarding the Golgi apparatus. One day, a visiting professor came and proved him wrong with indisputable scientific evidence. Dawkins's professor, after being proven wrong, basically stood up and said, "Thank you for proving me wrong," and then everyone clapped. To me, the story illustrates how correcting someone's false beliefs is neither disrespectful nor a personal attack. It is a most precious gift, because by showing someone that they are wrong, you are gifting them the opportunity to grow past it. Due to a lifetime of respect I've had for Richard Dawkins, I am now offering the same gift to him in the form of this video. I will explain how wrong he is, how absolutely idiotic his recent statements have been, and how he is embarrassing himself with his intellectual dishonesty. This declaration may seem harsh to people unfamiliar with Dawkins's work, so I will explain my reasoning. In a conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins was once presented with the following thought experiment.
Let me take an even more extreme example, which is fictitious in this case. Imagine that you were going to consult a doctor, and I make him an eye doctor, because they're sort of, above the waist, but you happen to know that he privately doesn't believe in the sex theory of reproduction. He believes that babies come from storks.
Okay.
I
wouldn't go to that doctor.
I'm guessing you would not go to that doctor, but I've met plenty of people, especially in America, who say, it's none of your business what he believes below the waist. He's an eye doctor. Is he a competent, can he repair your cataracts? And I don't think he should be employed in a hospital, because what you're saying about that man is that he's got the kind of mind which is so adrift from reality that even if he's a competent eye surgeon, I don't think he could be trusted.
To Dawkins, atheism wasn't simply an opinion, it was the product of scientific reason, and he argued that skepticism should not be applied selectively. You are either a skeptic or you aren't. So yes, Dawkins may still be correctly championing for scientific reason in other areas, but he has betrayed science by his own standards, and as such, he has lost all credibility as a man of science and a science communicator. Of course, if he realizes how dumb he's being and stops promoting ignorance and anti-science rhetoric, then he will gain his credibility back, and this video will help him do that, should he watch it. Funnily enough, it's quite ironic that he recently put out a statement agreeing with Jordan Peterson, of all people, that wokeism is a religion, when Dawkins himself seems to have been indoctrinated by TERF dogma. On his YouTube channel, The Poetry of Reality, Dawkins was asked an incredibly loaded question.
Can a woman become a man and a man become a woman?
No. Simple answer. Of course not. This is one of the big political hot potatoes of the day. There are plenty of people who suffer, not plenty, there are a few people who suffer from what's called gender dysphoria, where they feel they've been born into the wrong body. And I've read books by people that have convinced me that this is a real condition, a real psychological condition. And so one has to be sympathetic to such people. And if they prefer to be called by a female name, if they start male and want to be called a female name or vice versa, then one should honor that and respect that. But that doesn't mean they really have become the other sex. You can't become the other sex. Sex is one of the very few, actually, true binary divisions that we have in biology.
The reason this question is loaded is because it makes no sense and exhibits a fundamental misunderstanding of trans issues. If I were asked this question, I would also say no, but for a different reason than what Dawkins offers. Trans people are not men who become women or women who become men. Just like gay people who come out of the closet are not straight people who become gay. They were always gay, they just weren't open about it, or in some cases, not aware of it. A trans person who transitions doesn't become another gender. They simply start openly adopting the expression and performativity of the gender they have always been. This can sometimes be hard for cis people to understand, though I don't see why, but I will try to offer an explanation that may make it easier to comprehend. Let's say you are a man, and you join an online community, but due to some misunderstanding or miscommunication, everyone in that online community assumes that you are a woman and refers to you as such. People treat you like a woman, talk to you as if you were a woman. Some guys even DM you to hit on you. All this may or may not bother you, but at some point you decide to clear up the misunderstanding and inform everyone that you are actually a man. And when you do that, people react with incredulity. People say stuff like, "Wait, what do you mean? How can you be a man? You're obviously a woman. Women can't suddenly become men. That's nonsense." That's how dumb this question is. Identity is innate. It's not something other people get to decide on for you. What other people perceive you as is not what you are. A closeted gay person is still gay. They are not straight just because you assume they're straight. Dawkins' take on all this is that men can't become women and women can't become men because sex is immutable. This is at best an intellectually dishonest answer, because the question is not about sex, it's about gender. But Dawkins doesn't seem to understand this distinction, or at least pretends he doesn't. He mocks the very concept of transitioning by comparing it to religious transubstantiation. This is simply a false equivalency. Identity cannot be transubstantiated because it's not a substance. When a person legally changes their name, they don't become a different person. They are still the same person, just with a different name. The same applies to gender transition. The most corporeal manifestation of gender is as a discrete variable on a legal document. The rest of it is either innate or cultural. Apparently, Dawkins believes that a person becomes trans by simply declaring it, but we'll get to that later. Let's get back on gender. Terms like man and woman refer to one's gender, while terms like male and female refer to one's sex. Gender is what we call a social construct. This means that how we conceptualize a man or a woman is almost entirely based on arbitrary cultural traditions. For example, the idea of a man in a dress in the modern West is considered strange. Many people get offended by the mere sight of such a thing. They may consider it unmanly or unmasculine, as if the sheer act of wearing a dress immediately invalidates a person's entire gender. However, in past civilizations, men wore open, non-divided, lower body garments all the time, and it was considered normal. So the idea that a skirt is women's clothing is purely cultural and exists solely as a performative expression of gender. In most definitions, gender consists of two things: gender identity and gender expression. In simple terms, these refer to how a person feels innately inside and how a person expresses their gender outwardly. Gender identity doesn't change, but gender expression can. So getting back to the question of whether a woman can be a man or a man can be a woman, obviously a man can't become a woman in the context of gender identity, because gender identity doesn't change. Unless, of course, we're talking about an internal transitioning, where a person finally comes to terms with their affirmed gender and abandons the false gender they were assigned at birth. However, gender expression can change, so a person who was previously presenting in one way can start presenting in a different way. This is an important part of what is called social transitioning. A person may stop presenting as masculine and start presenting as feminine by having longer hair, using makeup, wearing high heels and dresses, grooming their body hair. These are all cultural gender signifiers, things a person uses to accentuate their gender. Now one may say, there's more to being a woman than to simply put on makeup and wear a dress. This sounds like a poor imitation of a woman, not real woman. In fact, by focusing on these superficial characteristics, this essentializes women to be nothing but their exterior appearance. This is actually a very common talking point among TERFs.
TERF is an acronym. It stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. This is a real thing. This is a group of women that hate transgender. They don't hate transgender women, but they look at trans women the way we blacks might look at blackface. It offends them. Like, ooh, this bitch is doing an impression of me. Now, I shouldn't speak on this because I am not a woman, nor am I a trans. But as we've established, I am a feminist. That's right. I'm Team TERF. I agree. Man. Gender is a fact. You have to look at it from a woman's perspective.
This, of course, is nonsense. Like it or not, almost everyone does this, regardless of gender identity or gender congruousness. In general, men like to accentuate their masculine signifiers, while women like to accentuate their feminine signifiers. Of course, there are cultural or aesthetic exceptions, where a few contrasting signifiers can paradoxically accentuate a person's gender even more. If you don't like it, don't do it. It's as simple as that. But telling other people what to do with their own bodies violates body autonomy. If a woman doesn't want to shave her armpits, that's her right. If a woman does want to shave her armpits, that's also her right. Neither is more woman than the other, and arguing about this is a waste of time. So if we assume that a woman becoming a man or a man becoming a woman refers to a person's gender expression, then the answer can be yes. But as I explained earlier, I find the question to be very inappropriately designed. Dawkins goes on to categorically state that sex is a binary. This is incorrect, and Dawkins should read up on the last few decades of biological research. Sex is very obviously a continuum. Yes, we have male and female on two ends, but people can be anywhere in between. There are males with low testosterone levels, females with high testosterone. There are intersex people. There are males with feminine facial bone structure and females with masculine facial bone structure. Sex is absolutely a continuum, both genotypically and phenotypically. Even if we were to dishonestly assume that sex solely refers to chromosomes, as Dawkins does in his answers, there are plenty of medical conditions which cause a person's anatomical sex to be at odds with their chromosomal or gonadal sex. For example, a person with complete androgen insensitive syndrome can have a seemingly female body with breasts, a vulva, and a vagina while having an XY karyotype. I can't help but wonder what Dawkins would decide to call this person. Anyway, Dawkins continues on to talk about Jan Morris's memoir Conundrum. I was pleasantly surprised to hear that he actually sat down and read a book written by a trans woman describing her experiences from a first-hand perspective. I would have liked it even better if he had read another book on trans people in the last 50 years. He does seem to have read plenty of TERF books though. Dawkins says that he believes Jan Morris, which is a very weird thing to say. A lot of transphobes seem to say this for some reason.
There's a big difference between her and a trans. The difference between her and a trans is I believe transgenders. I don't understand them either, but I know they mean what they say. Them niggas cut their dicks off. That's all the proof I need. I've never seen somebody just throw their dick away. Don't need it. I don't understand, but I believe you and I support your decision, motherfucker.
Dawkins goes on to use very inflammatory language to describe physical transitioning, calling it a horrific ordeal, and uses it as evidence that Jan Morris must be telling the truth if she is willing to undergo all that, which is such an absurd line of reasoning that I can't even begin to unpack it. Why do trans people need to be tortured for you to believe them? Why can't you accept their point of view? Do you also not believe that autistic people exist, or that dyslexic people exist? Do we have to torture all of them in order to be convinced that they must really experience things the way they claim they do? It is such an illogical viewpoint. Of course, an obvious bad faith counter-argument would be, well, what if someone claims to be talking to God? Should we also blindly believe that too? Which is obviously an idiotic question, because we don't need to believe anyone. We have scientific evidence confirming the biological reality of gender identity. Twin studies have excluded environmental factors by showing that a disproportionately high percentage of twins who grew up in separate families were both trans. Certain genes have been isolated as potential causes for incongruous gender identity. So being trans is not psychological, it's not a delusion, it's not a religious belief, it's a biological fact.
A woman can have a penis. A trans woman is a woman. I object to that because that's a distortion of language and a distortion of science.
Dawkins often likes to say that a woman with a penis is a distortion of language, if not reality. But it is he who engages in both. A male person can have a feminine gender identity, and that's a biological fact. Dawkins is straight up denying scientific reality. As for the linguistic distortion, that's an oxymoron by definition. Language is dynamic and constantly evolves. There is no such thing as distortion, it's just another mutation. I would expect the person who literally gave birth to the concept of meme theory would understand this. In the past, terms like sex and gender were used interchangeably. Now, we use more accurate language to succinctly reflect the meaning we intend. Woman with a penis is a consciousness raiser, something Dawkins himself spoke of extensively in his books. It is meant to help us question what our language mistakenly takes for granted. Dawkins then tries to make a comparison between trans people like Jan Morris, who underwent brutal transitioning in the 1970s, and trans people like Leah Thomas, whom Dawkins views as opportunists who merely pretend to be trans in order to win a few gold medals and break world records in sports.
But she showed her credentials by going through a horrendous series of operations and hormone treatments and things, so she really meant it. I have rather less time for people who it looks as though they say want to break female swimming records or something, and so just stand up and announce I am from henceforth a woman, and therefore I'm allowed to go in for women's swimming competitions. I don't have much time for them. I think that they might very well be chances.
I honestly feel second-hand embarrassment for Dawkins' stupidity on this one. He is actually insinuating that a man who is mediocre at a sport will transition, change their legal identity, undergo years of hormone replacement therapy, become a social pariah since society treats trans people like subhuman trash, all just to win at a sports game. This is so stupid that I shouldn't even have to debunk it, but I will. First of all, the prevalent method for inferring one's gender identity through their gender expression is to observe if it is consistent, insistent, and persistent. So a man who simply says, "By the way, I'm a woman," isn't immediately and blindly viewed as trans. The declared gender identity has to be consistent, insistent, and persistent. This applies to all gender identities, not just trans people. As an example, we can assume that Richard Dawkins is a cis man. We assume it because he has been consistently referring to himself as a man. He insistently requests to be referred to as a man, and if challenged, he persistently corrects others that he is in fact a man. But what if Richard Dawkins came out tomorrow as a trans woman? If she did that, she would most likely address all of these 3 points. She would say something like, "In all my life, I felt more like a woman than a man." That's consistent. She might say, "From now on, I want people to refer to me as a woman." That's insistent. She might also say, "In all my life, whenever people called me Mr. or Sir, I internally cringed, but didn't say anything because I was afraid." That's persistent. This is how most people transition. They don't randomly say, "Oh, by the way, I'm a woman, so I'm gonna compete in sports against women." Speaking of which, there are regulations regarding how trans people compete in organized sports events. Trans people didn't suddenly appear in 2020. They have existed for as long as humanity has existed. Usually, when an athlete transitions, they are not allowed to compete for a specific period of time. The length of this period is dictated by whatever the most recent scientific research proposes. Also, Leah Thomas didn't break any world records after transitioning. In fact, her performance decreased significantly. But aside from all that, reframing the discussion of trans issues as a sports issue is a very common distraction tactic, again among TERFs. The issue of trans in sports is a non-issue that will solve itself with time. As soon as we have thorough and solid research, we can use that to decide, instead of random anecdotes. So why don't we let the science decide on what rules to impose on trans competitors, instead of the wild conjectures of the uninformed and the ignorant? This idea that many or even some trans people are just opportunists pretending to transition in order to reap the benefits of being a woman is extremely dangerous, because it dehumanizes a part of the population that is already immensely disadvantaged. It's not unlike people of the past accusing epileptics of faking it for attention, or autistics of being lazy, or dyslexics of being unintelligent.
Surgery for like
thoughts of
teens.
had come up, but
Well, she thinks she's doing good. Well, that's the charitable interpretation. She thinks she's ultimately saving them from suicide or whatever the myth is, but it's really quite.
I'm rather hoping that surgeons like that end up getting sued.
Yeah, I'm too. Well, I think actually that might happen.
Because, well, the age of consent is an age at which a girl is thought to be old enough to consent to have sexual relations with a man. So if a surgeon who had done top surgery on a girl of 14 was sued, it shouldn't be a defense to say, well, she wanted it, because she was below the age of consent.
But there's also...
In a more recent video, Richard Dawkins posited the absurd argument that a person under the age of consent should not have access to gender-affirming healthcare because she can't consent to it. Top surgery is a medical procedure, not a sex act. Apparently, Richard Dawkins opposes patient autonomy now. According to his logic, if a 14-year-old girl was raped and wants to have an abortion, she shouldn't be able to because she can't consent to it. Any underage girl with religious fundamentalist parents would be unable to access any gynecological care because she wouldn't be able to consent to it. Once again, we see the inherent conservatism in anti-trans rhetoric. Richard Dawkins is claiming to be fighting for feminism while advocating for women to have less rights. Richard Dawkins' views on trans people are not just objectively and factually incorrect, they are dangerously incorrect, because they actively contribute to an environment of persecution against a marginalized group. I understand that Dawkins has been indoctrinated by conservative and TERF dogma, and breaking free from any form of indoctrination can be difficult, even when confronted with a mountain of scientific evidence that directly disproves one's false beliefs. And it is truly sad to see Dawkins become exactly like the people he used to fight against. But if he doesn't recover from it, he is no longer a man of science. Currently, Richard Dawkins has proven himself to be, by his own definition, a charlatan, fully deserving of scorn and mockery for the harm he is causing, both to the world of science and to the transgender community. And needless to say, any such harm affects all of us. Thank you for watching.